Welcome once again to the Brattlecast, a first-hand look at second-hand books. I'm Jordan Rich, and it's always a pleasure to be with Ken Gloss from the Brattle Bookshop in Boston. An absolute legendary place. People should put it on their must-see list when they come to town on, of course, West Street in downtown Boston. And our Brattlecast is now everywhere on Apple, Google Play, any of the major podcast platforms. Do check us out. Don't forget to download, rate, review, and certainly subscribe. Ken, we're going to get a little personal with you today. People love to hear stories about the family business and how things evolved. And you and I have known each other for many years now, and we've done this Brattlecast for a while. But we'd like to talk to you about you. And your dad was legendary. I keep using that word, George Gloss. And was it always expected that young Ken would be the successor? Was that George's plan all along? Was it always your plan?
Well, I don't know whether it was his plan all along. I know it's something that he would have wanted all along.
Right.
Matter of fact, my parents told me my first word was book.
Well, there you go.
Well, they took over the store in 1949. I was born in 1950. I'm sure they were talking about books all the time, so I don't doubt that it was. and I worked after school in elementary school, junior high school, summers during college. And in some of the times, I remember being, and this is sort of a different era, but I remember being 7 and 8 years old. And sometimes my father would call the house and he needed a check to put in the bank. And we lived in Dorchester. The store was in Scully Square at that time. And literally, I would walk up to Norfolk Street, take the bus into Ashwan Station, take the red line to Park Street, get out, bring things over. I mean, my parents made sure my mother in particular went with me 2 or 3 times to make sure I knew the route. Mm-hmm. And then after that, it was like, sure, go ahead.
Those were good old days when you could do that kind of. But again, you're young, and I'm curious, what were some of your jobs in the store? Was it stacking books or?
Well, a lot of the jobs were. The 2 things that I remember the most was putting books away. In other words, we would go out. My father would have piles, and literally, my father would have piles and piles of books all around him at the store. And he would price them. He would put the prices in, and then someone had to put them away in the sections, clean the place up. I guess every kid says sweep the store. Yeah. We also had outside tables that had to come in and out. It wasn't quite as large as we have now, but there was always the outside element of the store where you would have books at that time at a dime and a quarter. Mm-hmm. And so there was a lot of jobs like that. And I think I learned a lot by osmosis. It just sort of learned it.
Now, you just said osmosis. People should know that you actually are trained in another area, which kind of is connected to osmosis. Tell us. Well,
I have a degree in chemistry. I went to the University of Massachusetts. High school, I went to Boston Latin School, which it's a great school, great people I've met, many I still know. One of the things I loved about it, you got out of school at 2 o'clock. It was about a 10-minute run to Fenway Park.
Well, you were raised right. Okay.
Enough to say
said.
on that.
Enough said.
But then, so I got my degrees in chemistry. And even when I was working in high school, I always loved working at the bookstore, mm-hmm. the books. The other thing that my job is my father, when he first was starting out, most of the buying he did was on Sundays. He'd get a call. And Sunday morning, many times, was the time he'd go out to people's houses because he was almost a one-man operation. He had an assistant, and that was my job, too, to carry and lug the books.
You were a schlepper at an early
I was
age.
a schlepper, but again, I was learning.
You were with your dad. Working. I remember my dad was an accountant for a major firm, and occasionally he'd take me to the office. It was a thrill when you were just a little kid. But here you are in an environment that is just so magical for particularly a young person. Did you like to read when you were a kid?
I like to read. I still like reading. Mm-hmm. I enjoy it. And, I like all types. I like books about books. There are a whole area of that. There are bibliodetectives where the whole premise is books. And this is something maybe for another one. But John Grisham came out with a book, not his newest one, but one called Camino Island. It's about book theft and manuscript theft. And I'm reading it. I'm going, that sounds like me. and it was a character based on me. And I won't say that I was the nicest character in it. We were fences. And do you know what bothered me the most? No, it wasn't about being a thief. He said it was a failing business.
Oh, no, you want to be a successful thief. Come on.
But that's for another story. But so I used to also go out on the buys and Sunday because that's a great learning. It's meeting the people, seeing how things are bought. In any case, I went to college at the University of Massachusetts, and I wanted to do something a little different. I had always done a lot of reading and history, but I said something different. And they said, well, they have a really good chemistry department. I said, fine, I'll be a chemistry major. And I went through it. I got my degree in chemistry. I even published a paper. And then I was going to go to Wisconsin for graduate school and in chemistry get a doctorate. One of my professors was a great professor there, and he got me a job in 1973 in New Haven working for Olin Matheson. Mm-hmm. And I saw what industrial chemistry was like. They got a new vice president in the day that I started. I saw heads roll. I saw people putting on. I saw safety standards, which I had problems with. But mainly, it's just industrial chemistry. And so when I drove out to Wisconsin to start the doctorate, I got there and I said, I don't want to do this right now. I needed a year off. And quite honestly, in the early 70s, my father's health wasn't all that great. Mm-hmm. And he said, sure, come back, work for a year. Mm-hmm. That year that I took off was 45 years ago. And I don't regret for a minute that I'm doing this and not in a laboratory somewhere. But the hardest part, the reason I have a degree in chemistry, by far the thing that held me back the most was working for my father. We're totally different characters with different personalities. And I'll tell you, if you probably talk to most people who have a family business, it's not the business itself necessarily. It's all the things that come up about that maybe had about it that had almost nothing to do with business, but you'd have arguments about. Yeah.
Oh my goodness, I could tell you stories from the interviews that I've done over the years, and also from personal experience. Small businesses, family businesses, it's all about the personalities and the strength of certain personalities. And I didn't know your dad personally, but I used to listen to him being interviewed on radio, and I was a big radio fan, obviously. And he was just so interesting, and I wondered if you could ever get a word in with your dad at the dinner table because he had so much to say.
Oh, no, you did. And even if you did get in a word, he didn't listen. It didn't make any difference.
Okay.
But I'll tell you, one of the great things, and I will give my father total and complete credit for this, he built the business because he was a character. He was a showman. He also knew tremendous amounts about books and so on. He would pull off stunts like giving away books, and they would come back 1,000-fold. One time, the store got robbed. Someone broke in at night, and they took a few dollars out of the register. And my father immediately got to the press and said, unless we raise the cultural element of our thieves, it's done. They didn't take any books. He was just so upset.
He was upset they didn't steal any books.
They didn't steal any of the books.
Oh, that's so funny.
But when I first started working there, like I said, my father had a very, very strong personality. Mine maybe didn't come over quite as strong, but, I had my ideas. And, the younger generation coming in, I used to get fired regularly.
Oh, I didn't know that.
The first few years, it was constant because I would want to do something one way. My father would have his way. He'd get angry at me and fire me. And what I used to do at the beginning was, we had a multi-story building. I would go up to the second or third floor, sit there and stew for a few hours, then sheepishly come back down, and my father would still be upset with me, and it would be a really hot afternoon. And after 6 months or a year of this, I said, wait a minute, he fired me. why don't I just leave? Well, I'll have the day off.
Yeah.
It would be fine. And what I realized was, after I started doing that, he fired me less and less because he actually realized I didn't mind. I'd take the day off.
By the way, you've mentioned your sisters in previous shows. Anyone else in the family follow along?
No,
you were just the...
And unfortunately, my sisters both died relatively young.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's something that happened.
Okay.
But my wife, though, works at the store.
Mm-hmm.
And she worked with my father for a while. That didn't work out as well either because we were too close. And then she went off and worked for the Boston Phoenix. And she also was the editor of the Boston Celtics yearbook for 10 years.
Oh, no kidding. Okay.
So now she works with me. My mother worked at the store for a while, too.
And how did she get along with your dad at the time?
When we had a very small store and we were in close contact, she absolutely would not work at the store. But when we got a slightly larger, she could be in a separate office off in the back where she couldn't be seen all the time. Then it worked.
I see. And for those who don't know, how did it happen? Did you take over before your father passed, or what?
Well, basically, I started in full-time in 1973. I was 23 years old. Mm-hmm. My father's health, again, was an issue. And about 2 years after that, he had open-heart surgery. Mm-hmm. And at that time, back in the 70s, open-heart surgery, especially where you weren't in great shape to start with, he was out for a year. I mean, literally.
Totally different
totally
scene
out.
back then, yeah.
And amazingly, I was 25 years old, and the store ran fine. Matter of fact, in some ways, it ran even a little smoother, at least in my mind. Maybe not in my father's. And then, so what happened after that is he lived in Newton Center, and there was a restaurant there called the Langley Deli.
Oh, sure, I remember that place.
But they had a group of men who were older, semi-retired or retired, who every morning would go in for breakfast. And so he would start showing up at 10, 10:30, 11 in the morning, and maybe then come in and leave a little bit earlier in the day. And I was sort of day-to-day running things. But we still had our differences of opinion, let's say. But by that time, I was there. But every once in a while, I was saying to myself, should I be a chemist? Should I really try to go back there? Is this going to work out? And then one of the big events that we talked about on another Brattlecast, in 1980, the store burnt down.
The fire, yeah.
And at that point, my father was pretty much coming in very occasionally. But one of the main things is he was there, he was the person of the store, and we slowly got back into business. But one of the real deals in the store, and I knew it very much, is that we needed to buy a building. Because even though it was a rundown area, I knew that at some point, well, my father knew. He said, this area is going to be great one day. He just was a little late on how long it took. And it is a great area. But I didn't want to deal with landlords. I wanted to be independent. I wanted to have something of our own. And we started looking probably a couple of years after the fire as we were getting our feet.
Right.
And I was looking and really wasn't finding anything. And I was starting to feel, wait a minute, this is not so great. About 3 years after the fire, the man who owned the building next to our building was going to move to California, and he knew we owned the land next to it. We had been very nice to him, let him park there all the time. And he approached us. He said, look, I want to sell the building. This is what the real estate says it's worth. This is what I want to do. I'll subtract 6%. This is the deal. And I knew this was absolutely the right thing to do. I also knew at that point, if I came to my father and said, this man wants to give us and pay us to take his building because it was my idea, he was going to say no. It was going to be an absolute no. Now, one of the customers and who became friends of ours and that my wife and I would go to dinner and my father liked a lot was a man named Edward Bernays.
Oh,
he was
the public relations guru of all time.
Public relations guru.
Brilliant man.
Brilliant man. But what he many times told me is, he said, many times people would hire me as a consultant, not because they didn't know what I was going to say, but they needed a neutral party in the meeting to say that. And I sort of said to myself, this is something has to get done. I can't present it. So I called our lawyer, who my father loved because he started collecting books when he was like 10 years old, collected books on trains. My father loved him. He was actually a very good lawyer, too. And I said to him, look, is there a good consultant on real estate? Because we should get this. I should have it checked anyways. And he said, I know just the right person. I said, great. I said, have him go down, evaluate the building, evaluate our situation with the renting. Joyce, my wife, and I, we're going to go on a vacation to the Caribbean for 10 days. 10 days later, my wife and I came back. My father had this great idea. Look,
Really?
this building's available.
Brilliant.
Yeah, brilliant. And then
love
it got, but I had realized at that time in the family business, in the situation, that's the way you had to do it.
Well, it's truly, you talk about being a book detective, we've talked about that.
Yeah.
Being a successful business person in today's world, or it's certainly in a family business, you have to employ psychology and have a good sense of people. And it's difficult. There are some huge companies that are family run that have these difficulties too. I mean,
Well, also, too, you learn, strategies and
right,
things.
ways to negotiate.
And the ultimate thing was I learned a tremendous amount from my father, particularly about you've got to market and publicize. He did the Channel 2 auction, which people loved and called all the time. He would get on the radio shows with Jerry Williams and Paul Benjamin.
He was a showman. He really was a showman.
But I learned very much that's very important. It's as important. So I learned a tremendous amount from him. And I also learned strategies so that we could possibly work together. And he died in 1985. So from then on, I was sort of the face of the business.
If he were here to join us on the Brattlecast, I'm sure he'd be very, very happy.
Oh, he'd be very happy. He'd be very proud. And then we'd get into a fight.
And then he'd fire you.
Then he'd fire me.
Wow.
And I'd be back the next day.
Well, sharing stories like this really, it brings you closer to the audience listening and to your customers who are, many of them, very, very good friends of yours. And I really thank you for sharing that. I did not know the full story. And your father was one of these larger-than-life characters. As a kid growing up and listening to him on the radio and hearing those wonderful stories, it's just great to get another sense of who he was.
And although I said it was hard and difficult and we had all our fights, it worked out absolutely the best for both of us, because if I hadn't come into the business when he started getting sick in the early 70s, probably the business would have just fallen apart and dissolved. I would not have had the opportunity to have this wonderful career that I absolutely love and enjoy. It worked.
And let me just say one thing. Because of UMass, you had an understanding of good chemistry.
I had a thank you. Absolutely.
It paid off. Ken Gloss, thank you so much, as always. These Brattlecasts are fun for me, and I know very interesting to the listeners. And I just want to remind people that they can find us by searching Apple, Google Play, any of the major, Stitcher, any of the major podcast sites. And, of course, we thank people for spreading the word about subscribing, downloading, rating, and reviewing. And you can go to Twitter, and the Twitter and Instagram accounts are at Brattle Bookshop, or go to brattlebookshop.com. Ken, we'll talk again real soon.
I'm looking forward to it. It's fun, and there are a million subjects.
Indeed. A first-hand look at secondhand books and more. I'm Jordan Rich. Have a great day.